Part 3, Challenges and Betrayals. Chapter 21, A Secret Alliance. The tension in the air was almost tangible as Seb and Alaric sat in the shadowy expanse of the underwater cavern. The space echoed with the quiet hum of the sea, broken only by the distant pulse of water moving through narrow stone channels. Glowing coral cast flickers of pale blue and violet light across their faces, illuminating the anxiety that neither of them could fully mask. It felt like the calm before a storm, but Seb wasn't sure whether the storm would come from outside or from within. His hands flexed against his knees, muscles tight, as he stared into the bioluminescent shimmer dancing across the cavern walls. Seb leaned forward, the movement slight but filled with unspoken tension. "You're certain they'll show?" he asked, voice low and wary. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have, like a challenge thrown into still water. His eyes narrowed as they flicked to Alaric, searching his face not just for answers, but for truth, something real to hold onto in this mess of loyalty and prophecy, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. Alaric didn't flinch under the scrutiny, but his reply came with less conviction than usual. "They'll come," he said, though the faint hitch in his breath betrayed him. He kept his gaze forward, watching the water ripple beyond the mouth of the cavern, as if willing the figures to emerge from the deep. "Not everyone in the council wants blood. Some believe in the prophecy. Some want peace." His jaw tightened. "But belief isn't the same as action. They've hidden behind silence for too long." The words struck Seb with a cold kind of clarity. He had seen this before. People too scared to stand up, too afraid to lose their place in a world that punished difference. He ran a hand over his jaw, feeling the rough stubble beneath his fingertips. "Fear," he muttered. "It always comes down to fear. They're afraid of change, of losing control, even if that change could save lives." He turned back to Alaric, eyes hard. "What makes you think they'll find courage now?" Alaric finally met his gaze, and in his eyes there was fire, banked but smoldering. "Because they don't have a choice anymore," he said, voice low and firm. "The tides are shifting. The humans are no longer just a distant threat. You're here. We're here. The prophecy is already in motion. And some of them know that standing still will only bring ruin." He paused, his expression tightening. "They'll come because the old ways are crumbling. And deep down, they know it." Seb didn't reply immediately. He studied Alaric, the quiet defiance in his posture, the way his voice carried both fear and hope. It was a rare thing, seeing him like this, caught between who he was raised to be and who he was becoming. Seb reached out, his hand brushing lightly against Alaric's. It was a small gesture, but in the stillness of the cavern, it felt like a vow. "Then let them come," he murmured. "Let them see us together. Let them see the truth they're trying so hard to deny." A silence settled between them, not heavy, but thoughtful. The soft glow of the coral reflected in Alaric's eyes as he nodded once, a slow and solemn motion. "We have to be ready for anything," he said. "Some may come to talk, but others might come to silence us." His hand turned to grasp Seb's in return, firm and warm. "No matter what happens, we stand our ground." Seb's jaw tightened, but he gave a sharp nod. He had faced danger before, knives at his throat, storms at his back, but this was different. This wasn't a fight of survival. It was a battle for meaning, for identity, for the right to stand beside someone the world said he should never have loved. "Then we stand," he said simply. "Together." Beyond the cavern's entrance, the water stirred, just a ripple at first, then a shift in pressure that made the coral pulse brighter for a breath. Seb's eyes sharpened. Alaric stood, silent and watchful, every line of his body tense. The meeting was about to begin, but the war for their future had already started. Seb exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his damp hair as the tension in his chest twisted tighter. The flickering coral light cast shadows over his face, deepening the hard lines carved by frustration. "Afraid?" he said, voice sharp as the edge of a blade. "Or just unwilling to risk their comfortable little world for a chance at something different?" He wasn't trying to provoke, not entirely, but the silence and fear cloaking the council's inaction made his blood boil. How could they claim to protect their people while refusing to see beyond their ancient walls? Alaric turned his head sharply, silver eyes flashing with quiet fire. "You don't understand what it's like, Seb," he said, the words clipped but heavy. "To grow up hearing stories of slaughter, of nets woven from steel and magic, of brothers dragged from the sea never to return. Those rules you scoff at? They were written in blood. Centuries of survival don't vanish just because one pirate sees a better way." His voice cracked slightly at the end, though he quickly covered it with a breath, a shift of his jaw. Seb didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. "And yet here you are," he said calmly, but with weight behind each word. "Trusting me." His gaze held steady, daring Alaric to deny it. "Despite everything you were taught. Despite what it could cost you. So don't tell me it's impossible. You already proved it isn't." He didn't mean it as a taunt. It was a reminder, a tether back to the connection they'd built through storms, silence, and sacrifice. Alaric's expression faltered for a heartbeat, something soft flickering beneath his carefully constructed mask. But it passed quickly, smoothed into something guarded. "I trust you because I've seen your heart," he admitted, his voice quieter now, more measured. "But that doesn't mean others will. And trust alone won't save us. The Council needs more than words. They need proof, of peace, of purpose. Of a future that won't drown them in ruin." Seb rose slowly to his feet, the motion deliberate, a challenge in his stance as he looked down at Alaric. "Then show them," he said. "Let them see that peace is worth fighting for. That this bond we have isn't weakness, it's strength. You and I, we've faced worse than disapproving stares and stubborn traditions." His voice didn't rise, but it held a conviction that echoed through the cavern. Alaric's eyes followed him, shadows playing across the sharp planes of his face. "You make it sound simple," he said, almost bitterly. "Like centuries of fear can be undone with a single act of defiance." He stood as well, the closeness between them now crackling with something unspoken. "But what if they don't listen, Seb? What if they see our bond and call it treason?" Seb's voice dropped to a murmur, low and fierce. "Then let them." He stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the hum of Alaric's magic, the tension coiled in his body. "If they want to see treason in love, in trust, in something real, then they're the ones betraying their people, not you." He wasn't just fighting for their future anymore. He was fighting to remind Alaric that he didn't have to carry this burden alone. Alaric stared at him for a long moment, the silence heavy with everything they hadn't yet said. Then, finally, he exhaled, the sound like the hush of waves against stone. "You make it so hard to walk away," he whispered. There was no bitterness in his tone now, only weariness and something far more dangerous: hope. Seb reached for his hand, their fingers brushing, linking. "That's the point," he said softly. "We're not meant to walk away." In that brief moment of contact, under the glow of the sea's quiet light, they stood not as pirate and siren, not as enemies or outcasts, but as something stronger. Something the Council, the prophecy, the world itself would have to reckon with. Alaric's expression softened, his usually guarded face revealing a glimpse of vulnerability. The words he spoke, quiet, but full of meaning, hung between them like a fragile thread. "I'm trusting us," he said. "There's a difference." It wasn't just about trusting Seb, or even the prophecy. It was about believing in the possibility that the two of them, together, could be something more than the chaos that had defined their lives. It was a confession, and a promise wrapped in restraint. Seb felt the weight of those words settle over him, heavier than any blade he had ever carried. He opened his mouth to respond, to tell Alaric that the trust wasn't misplaced, that he would stand by him through whatever storm came next, but the moment was shattered by a soft, unmistakable sound. A shift of water, the gentle scrape of movement against stone. Both men froze. Alaric's head snapped toward the entrance of the cavern, eyes narrowing. The flicker of warmth he'd just shown vanished, replaced in an instant by the cold alertness of a leader preparing for confrontation. "They're here," he said, voice low and tense. Without hesitation, he stepped toward the edge of the shadows, each motion fluid and controlled, like a ripple in still water. Seb's instincts kicked in. His hand moved to the knife strapped to his belt, a relic from his days on the deck of a pirate ship, before fate had dragged him into Alaric's world. It was strange, how natural it felt to reach for the weapon, even now. Even here. He gripped it, not out of fear, but readiness. Whatever conversation was about to happen, it might not end in words. The silence in the cavern stretched, thick and alive. The glow from the bioluminescent corals danced across the walls, making the space feel both sacred and perilous. Seb shifted his weight subtly, keeping his body loose, prepared for whatever would emerge from the shadows. He didn't trust these council members, not yet. But he trusted Alaric, and for now, that would have to be enough. Figures began to materialize from the darker edges of the cavern, their forms ghostly at first, like whispers from the deep. They moved with purpose, with the regal wariness of creatures who had lived their lives in secret, in power, in fear. Seb counted 5 sirens in total, each one wearing the same look of cautious appraisal. None of them spoke at first. Alaric straightened as they approached, every inch the Prince Seb had come to know, composed, commanding, dangerous. "You came," he said, his voice echoing faintly off the stone walls. It was not a greeting, but a statement. A challenge, perhaps? He didn't bow, didn't offer false pleasantries. There was too much at stake for ceremony. One of the sirens, a tall woman with sea-glass eyes and kelp woven into her hair, stepped forward. "Only because you called," she said, her tone cool but curious. "And because we heard rumors." Her gaze slid to Seb, sharp and unreadable. "The human who walks in sacred currents. The pirate who carries the mark." Seb met her eyes without flinching, knife still in hand, though lowered now. "I'm not here to threaten your world," he said clearly. "But I won't apologize for being part of his." He nodded toward Alaric, his voice calm but firm. "Whatever you believe about humans, about the prophecy, I'm here because I believe in him." The truth hung between them like a gauntlet thrown at their feet. And now, it was the council's move. From the shadows of the cavern, 3 figures emerged, their movements graceful and alien, gliding silently through the water like ghosts summoned from the deep. The faint glow of the bioluminescent coral caught on their scales, outlining their forms with an ethereal shimmer. The first figure, tall and imposing, had dark blue scales that seemed to swallow the light, giving them a regal, almost ominous presence. Their face was stern, carved with the kind of authority that came from years of command, but their eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed not on Alaric, but on Seb. The second figure hovered just behind the tall one, noticeably smaller and more delicate in build. Their scales were a soft, pearlescent green, shimmering with a nervous flicker as they glanced around the cavern. There was something hesitant in their posture, as if they were unsure whether they should have come at all. Their hands fluttered slightly at their sides, betraying an anxious energy that contrasted sharply with the stillness of the others. The third siren stood slightly apart, broader and more muscular, with a long scar carved down one side of their face. Their expression was guarded, lips pressed into a firm line as they scanned the cavern's interior. Though their stance was tense, their body language wasn't overtly aggressive, more like someone prepared for trouble, but not looking to start it. Their eyes moved briefly to Seb's blade, but they made no move to react. "Alaric," the tall siren spoke first, their voice smooth as velvet but edged with steel. The echo carried through the cavern, underscoring the weight of their authority. "You've taken quite the risk calling us here. You've broken the protocols of secrecy for the sake of a human." There was no hostility in their words, only a kind of cold scrutiny. Alaric didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his posture unyielding, the leader within him rising to meet the tension head-on. "And yet you came," he said, each word deliberate. "Because you feel it too. The shift in the currents. The prophecy is no longer myth. It's moving, alive. We can't pretend otherwise." The smaller siren fidgeted at those words, their gaze darting towards Seb, then back to Alaric. "We've heard the whispers," they said, voice softer, barely more than a ripple in the silence. "But that doesn't mean we should act. We don't even know if he's the one the prophecy speaks of." We don't know if any of this is real. It's real, Seb said, stepping forward, his voice calm but firm. I've seen what's coming. I've lived through it. I didn't ask to be part of your world, but I'm in it now. And I'm not here to tear it apart. I'm here to help stop what's coming, whatever it is. He didn't reach for his knife this time. His hands were open, steady. I'm here because I believe in Alaric. And if that's not enough for you, then maybe this prophecy doesn't mean what you think it does. The scarred siren let out a low breath, something between a scoff and a sigh. Belief, they muttered. That's not something we've had the luxury of for a long time. Their gaze lingered on Alaric for a moment, something flickering behind their guarded expression. But we're listening. For now. Alaric inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that didn't undermine his authority. That's all I ask, he said. Listen. Look past your fear, past the old laws. We stand at the edge of something greater than ourselves. If we turn away now, we may not get another chance. The silence that followed was thick with possibility, the tension curling through the cavern like a current beneath still waters. The council members didn't speak again, but something had shifted, an unspoken acknowledgement that the tide was changing. And in that quiet moment, Seb realized that maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't already lost. The tall siren's gaze flicked sharply to Seb, the glow of the cavern casting deep shadows across their face. There was no warmth in their expression, only cool judgment and tightly restrained skepticism. And this is the human? They asked, their tone heavy with disdain, each word carefully measured. The pirate you've bound yourself to? The title dripped with condescension, a word laced with history and distrust, and the air around them seemed to grow colder. Seb felt his muscles tighten, a natural response honed from years of surviving confrontations far more brutal than this one. But this wasn't just another enemy sizing him up. This was a gatekeeper, a voice of power in a world he barely understood. He wanted to lash out, to challenge the insult buried in the siren's words, but something in Alaric's stillness beside him urged restraint. So Seb bit back his retort, swallowing the fire that burned in his throat. Alaric stepped forward, not aggressively, but with purpose. He placed himself just a fraction in front of Seb, an instinctive, protective shift that did not go unnoticed. This is Captain Sebastian Kane, he said, his voice even, but unwavering. He's not just a pirate. He's stood with me against what's coming. He's faced danger most of our kind wouldn't survive. And more importantly, he has been chosen. The prophecy speaks through him, whether you believe it or not. The words echoed, reverberating through the silent cavern like a current cutting through still water. There was defiance in Alaric's voice, but also conviction, the kind that came from more than belief. From experience. From the bond they shared, however fragile it had become under the weight of so many expectations. The burly siren with the scar narrowed their eyes, letting out a low, guttural growl that reverberated from their chests like distant thunder. A human, they said flatly. Chosen or not, he is still what he is. Flesh and greed. A creature of war. We've buried too many because of his kind. The accusation lingered, heavy and unyielding, and Seb could feel the tension in the cavern rise like the pressure of a storm gathering in the deep. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Seb finally said, his voice rough but steady. He stepped forward, ignoring the way the council watched him as if he were something fragile, dangerous, or both. I know what I've done. I've sailed under bloodied flags, stolen from your waters, fought your kind without understanding what I was fighting. But I'm not that man anymore. I didn't come here to justify my past. I came to change the future. The smaller, green-scaled siren looked up at him then, their nervous fidgeting stilling slightly. And you believe this future includes us? They asked, their voice barely audible. Even after everything? Seb turned toward them, meeting their eyes without hesitation. It has to, he said. Because if it doesn't, there won't be anything left for any of us. This prophecy, it's not about choosing sides. It's about survival. And I'm not here to tear your world apart. I'm here to stand with it. With him. He nodded toward Alaric, his voice softening slightly. With all of you, if you'll let me. A long silence followed. The tall siren's expression remained unreadable, but their gaze lingered on Alaric, then on Seb. No final verdict was passed, not yet, but the edge in their stance softened, just barely. The tide had not turned fully in Seb's favor, but something had shifted in the depths. And for now, that was enough. No, Alaric snapped, his voice slicing through the cavern like a blade through water. You think I'm risking everything for love, for something foolish or selfish, but I'm not. I'm risking everything for the chance at peace. For a future where we don't have to hide in the shadows, where our people don't have to see every ship on the horizon as a threat. The prophecy speaks of a union between our worlds, a bond that can shift the tide of fate itself. Seb and I, we are part of that bond. His voice wavered slightly at the end, but not from doubt, only from the weight of truth. For a moment, silence stretched between them, as tense and taut as a bowstring. Then the smaller siren, the one with seafoam-colored scales and wide, uncertain eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. Their voice was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried a fragile hope that clung to every syllable. If the prophecy is true, they said, their gaze flicking between Alaric and Seb, then perhaps this human isn't our enemy. Perhaps he's something more. A bridge. A beginning. Seb didn't move. He stood as still as the stone beneath his feet, but inside, everything was racing. The vulnerability in Alaric's words, the shift in the smaller siren's tone, it all struck him like a wave that he hadn't braced for. He hadn't come here to be anyone's savior, or even their symbol. But now, faced with this moment, he realized how deeply entangled he had become in a world far greater than himself. The tall siren's gaze, cold and unreadable, turned fully to Seb. Their stare was penetrating, a silent interrogation that seemed to pull apart every layer of him in search of something solid beneath the surface. Do you even understand what's at stake, human? They asked, the words sharp with accusation. This isn't just about you and Alaric. It's not about sentiment or prophecy as a romantic idea. It's about centuries of war, of blood spilled in salt and silence. The Council won't see your presence here as hopeful, they'll see it as a threat. Seb straightened, jaw tight, shoulders squared against the weight of their scrutiny. I don't pretend to understand all your history, he said, his voice steady. But I understand war. I understand loss. And I understand what it means to want something more. I'm not here to replace your traditions or demand you change. I'm here because I believe we can build something better, because Alaric believes it, and that's enough for me to fight for it. You speak like someone who's never faced the wrath of our council. The burly siren rumbled, his arms crossed over his chest. Words don't sway them. They fear change more than they fear death. And yet you're here, Alaric interjected quietly, his gaze locking with the burly siren's. All of you came. You could have refused. You could have condemned me without even listening. But you didn't. You showed up. That means you're not as afraid of change as you think. The smaller siren shifted, glancing toward the tall one as if seeking reassurance or permission to hope. If the council sees that the bond is real, they whispered, if they witness it with their own eyes, would that not be proof enough? The tall siren didn't answer immediately. Their gaze returned to Seb once more, lingering longer this time. When they finally spoke, their tone was quiet, but heavy with meaning. Proof is not always enough to silence fear. But sometimes, it's enough to plant doubt. And that may be all the prophecy needs to take root. Seb met the tall siren's gaze head-on, refusing to yield even a fraction of ground. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, forged in the fire of everything he'd already endured. I understand what's at stake, he said, each word deliberate. But I also know that nothing changes without risk. You think I don't know the cost? I've already lost my ship, my crew, everything that defined who I was. But if there's even a chance that Alaric and I can make a difference, I'll take that risk. For him. For us. The last words rang out like a vow, not just to the sirens, but to Alaric himself. The cavern grew quiet in the wake of his declaration. The bioluminescent light flickered softly along the cavern walls, reflecting in eyes that now watched him with something more complex than distrust, something approaching consideration. The silence pressed in on them all, heavy and charged, until it was no longer awkward but reverent, like a moment of shared breath before a storm. Alaric turned slightly, his gaze finding Seb's face with a look that was no longer guarded or uncertain. There was pride there, yes, but something deeper shimmered beneath it: gratitude, affection, and a profound ache born of years spent hiding his heart behind duty. "He means what he says," Alaric murmured, his voice quiet but resolute. "He's already proven that to me in more ways than one. I wouldn't have brought him here if I wasn't certain." The tall siren, who had carried the weight of authority like armor, finally allowed their shoulders to lower slightly. Their expression didn't soften, not entirely, but there was a shift in their presence, a lessening of the rigid distance they'd maintained. "You're bold, human," they said at last. "Foolish, perhaps, but bold. And sometimes boldness is what breaks a cycle that has gone unchallenged for too long." They stepped closer, their form cutting a stark silhouette against the glowing cavern wall. "If Alaric believes in you, then perhaps there's merit in this alliance. Perhaps." Their eyes swept over Seb again, colder now. "But make no mistake, this will not be easy. There are those who will stop at nothing to see you fail. And if you falter, it won't just be your life at risk. It will be his as well." Seb didn't flinch at the warning. He felt it settle into his bones like a second skin, a new weight added to the ones he already carried. "Then I won't falter," he said simply. He didn't offer promises he couldn't keep. He didn't speak of destiny or fate. He just let the quiet steel in his voice carry the truth of his resolve. The smaller siren, still lingering just behind the others, looked between Seb and Alaric, their expression somewhere between awe and fear. "If you two can convince the council," they said softly, "you might change everything. But they'll test you first. You'll have to stand before them, not just as allies, but as proof." Alaric nodded slowly, as if he had already expected this. "Then we'll stand before them together," he said, turning to Seb with a slight incline of his head. "No matter what it takes." For the first time since entering the cavern, Seb felt a flicker of hope take root in the center of his chest, not just for survival, but for a future he'd never thought possible. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it would be worth it. "We're aware of the risks," Alaric said, his voice unwavering despite the tension surrounding them. The light from the bioluminescent coral painted him in ghostly hues, but his stance radiated strength. His silver eyes scanned the gathered sirens, pausing on each of them as if daring anyone to contradict him. "But we're not backing down. Not now. Not when we've come this far." The burly siren, still standing with arms crossed, let out a low huff, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you propose we do?" he asked, tone tinged with both cynicism and a begrudging curiosity. "The council is fractured. The factions against you are growing stronger by the day. They've already labeled you a traitor in some circles. You think a few hopefuls and a human are enough to shift that tide?" Alaric stepped forward, his voice gaining power as he spoke, as if the gravity of the moment anchored his every word. "We need to unite those who believe in the prophecy. Quietly, for now. We build a coalition, those who are willing to see beyond the past, who are tired of living in fear. If we can present a united front, show them that peace is more than a dream, that it's possible, then we stand a chance." Seb watched Alaric as he spoke, feeling the conviction in his voice echo through the cavern. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something larger, an entire world caught between ancient fears and the possibility of change. And Alaric, despite everything he'd endured, was standing at the center of it, willing to risk it all. The smaller siren shifted uneasily, glancing toward the tall one. "And if the traditionalists strike first?" they asked hesitantly. "If they find out what we're planning, they won't hesitate to act. We'll all be labeled traitors. We could be executed. Then we make sure they don't find out until it's too late," Alaric replied. "We use their arrogance against them. They think they've won already, that no one would dare stand against centuries of rule. That's our advantage." The tall siren narrowed their eyes, watching Alaric closely. You speak with certainty, but what you ask is dangerous. It isn't just your life on the line anymore. It's ours too. If we agree to this, if we move forward, there's no turning back. I know, Alaric said softly, but with no hesitation. And I'm not asking you to follow blindly. I'm asking you to believe in a better future. One where we're not always looking over our shoulders, not always preparing for the next war. We deserve that. Our people deserve that. Seb stepped up beside him then, his voice calm but firm. And you're not alone in this. I'm with him. Whatever comes, we face it together. He met each of their gazes in turn, letting them see the fire that had kept him alive through storms, mutinies, and exile. This isn't just Alaric's fight. It's mine, too. A silence settled over the group, thick and thoughtful. The glow around them pulsed like a heartbeat, as if the cavern itself held its breath. And slowly, one by one, the sirens nodded, tentative, but real. The tide was turning. The smaller siren nodded slowly, the bioluminescent light casting soft ripples across their pale features. It won't be easy, they murmured, more to themselves than anyone else. But it's not impossible. There was a tremor in their voice, a delicate balance of fear and hope, like the edge of a wave unsure if it would crash or roll gently to shore. They looked at Alaric with a new kind of respect, as though seeing him not just as a warrior, but as a catalyst for something greater. The tall siren turned sharply, their focus locking onto Seb with renewed intensity. Their gaze was sharp, unwavering, like the tip of a harpoon before the strike. And you, Captain Kane? They asked, their voice steady and cool. Are you prepared to fight for this? To prove that you're worthy of standing beside Alaric? There was no malice in their tone, only the weight of centuries behind the question. This wasn't about pride, it was about survival. Seb didn't flinch beneath the scrutiny. Instead, he straightened his spine, his shoulders squaring as if instinctively preparing for a coming storm. His hand found the hilt of the knife at his side, not as a threat, but a silent symbol of everything he'd endured. The blade was a remnant of his old life, a relic of ship decks, treachery, and endless seas. It was a reminder that he was a survivor. I've faced storms, Seb began, his voice calm but laced with steel. Battles. Betrayal. I've seen friends turn on me, and I've walked away from fires that should have swallowed me whole. His eyes flicked to Alaric, and something softened in his expression. But I've never faced anything that mattered as much as this. The cavern was quiet as his words echoed softly against the stone, sinking into the water like dropped anchors. The gathered sirens watched him, some with curiosity, others with disbelief. But Seb held their gaze, unwavering, his voice unwavering. If you're asking if I'm ready to fight for Alaric, he said, his hand still on his blade, then hear me clearly, I already am. Alaric's eyes shimmered faintly in the blue light, silver reflecting silver. Pride flickered across his face, but more than that, there was something deeper. A quiet, aching gratitude. He had spent a lifetime under the pressure of duty, the weight of legacy. Now, for the first time, he didn't have to carry it alone. The burly siren grunted, the sound half approval, half reluctant respect. Brave words, human, he said, arms still crossed over his chest. Let's hope your actions live up to them. We've lost too much already to gamble on promises. I'm not asking you to gamble, Seb replied, his voice like steady wind in taut sails. I'm offering a partnership. A chance to change everything we thought we knew. Alaric and I, we don't want to rule or destroy. We want to build. Together. The tall siren tilted their head, considering. Very well, they said at last. You've spoken your truth. Now comes the hard part. If you truly mean to stand beside Alaric, then you must prove it, not with words, but with deeds. They turned toward the depths beyond the cavern's mouth, where shadow and sea stretched endlessly. The tides will test you. Let's see if you're ready. The tall siren's gaze lingered on Seb, measuring him, perhaps weighing the sincerity in his words. The flicker of judgment that had been there before seemed to soften, replaced by a hard-earned understanding. After a long pause, The siren gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Very well, they said, their voice carrying the finality of a decision made. We'll help you. But tread carefully, human. The ocean is vast, and its secrets are dangerous. The warning hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken history, a reminder of the treacherous depths that lay ahead. Seb could sense the layers of caution in their words, layers built from years of survival in a world that demanded both strength and secrecy. Seb nodded in return, a silent acknowledgement of the trust they were placing in him. There was no grand promise, no sweeping declaration. Only the quiet, intense understanding that the stakes had just been raised. This wasn't a simple alliance. It was a pact born of necessity, of survival. They all stood on the edge of a precipice, and there was no turning back. The ocean was an unforgiving mistress, and it would test every one of them. As the tall siren's words echoed in his mind, the group shifted, moving to the far side of the cavern where shadows gathered, and the flickering light of bioluminescence cast eerie glows across their faces. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices a low murmur blending with the sounds of the ocean beyond. Seb felt his pulse quicken, the tension thickening the air around them. The sirens, once distant and wary, were now engaged in a quiet strategy session. The stakes were high, and the gravity of their alliance weighed heavily on everyone present. Seb stood a little apart from them, allowing the voices of the sirens to wash over him. His mind raced as he tried to process the enormity of what had just happened. For so long, he had felt like an outsider in this world, a human in a realm of creatures whose ways and politics were foreign to him. But now, after all the turmoil and uncertainty, he felt the stirrings of something new, a bond, not just with Alaric, but with this underwater world itself. They weren't alone in this fight. The sirens, though wary and cautious, had agreed to stand by them. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Seb allowed himself a brief moment of hope. It was fragile, like a flicker of light in the depths of a storm, but it was there. The possibility that, together, they might just be able to challenge the fate that had been thrust upon them. Seb wasn't sure how they would pull it off. He wasn't even sure they had a solid plan yet, but the chance was there, and that alone was worth fighting for. His eyes shifted to Alaric, who stood across the cavern, speaking quietly with the smaller siren. There was something in the way Alaric's posture had changed, a slight easing of the tension that had been so pervasive in his movements before. Seb could see the glint of determination in his eyes, the same resolve that had kept him going through countless trials. But now, there was something more, hope, perhaps, or the belief that this alliance, this fragile partnership between their worlds, might actually work. The sound of the waves outside seemed to grow louder as the sirens continued their hushed discussion. The ocean beyond was vast, unknowable, and filled with dangers that few could comprehend. But it also held the potential for change, for something greater than the endless cycle of fear and bloodshed. The alliance they were forging now was fragile, like the calm before the storm, but Seb knew they had to fight for it, every step of the way. They had to prove that peace was worth risking everything. The words of the tall siren echoed again in his mind, "Tread carefully, human." Seb understood the weight of that warning. He was stepping into a world that wasn't his own, a world governed by ancient laws and rules that had been in place for centuries. The sirens weren't simply agreeing to stand beside him. They were agreeing to challenge everything they had known. And that was a risk, a dangerous one that could cost them everything. But for the first time since he had set foot in this strange world, Seb felt a sense of purpose burning inside him. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for a future, one that wasn't defined by fear or the bitter hatred between their two worlds. The tides were changing. And together, with Alaric by his side, with the sirens backing them, they might just have a chance to shift the currents in their favor. Chapter 22. A Forbidden Kiss. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow across the dense forest clearing. The night was still, save for the rustling of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. The air was thick with the scent of pine, mingling with the faint hum of nocturnal creatures hidden in the shadows. Seb's boots crunched on the frost-kissed grass as he paced in tight circles, the rhythmic sound grounding him as his thoughts spiraled. His mind raced, replaying the events of the evening over and over again, each moment a sharp pang of frustration and anger that refused to fade. It hadn't been supposed to happen like this. They were supposed to be a well-oiled machine, focused solely on the mission ahead. Precision, restraint, and calculated action were essential, qualities Seb had always prided himself on, traits that had kept him alive through countless dangers. Yet, with each passing day, with each tense conversation and heated exchange, the mission seemed to slip further out of his control. And every time Alaric entered the room, his commanding presence and sharp, biting words pushed Seb's carefully constructed walls closer to crumbling. Seb clenched his fists, his frustration a gnawing ache in his chest. He had never been one to let emotions interfere with his decisions, yet here he was, caught in the whirlwind of anger and resentment that always seemed to flare up when Alaric was near. It was as though the siren had a way of dismantling everything Seb had worked so hard to build, unraveling his control, exposing vulnerabilities he didn't want to acknowledge. This mission was everything to him, and yet it felt like it was slipping away, like their partnership was doomed from the start. "Going to wear a hole in the ground, are you?" A voice, familiar and laced with a hint of amusement, broke through Seb's thoughts. The drawl was unmistakable, the calm tone masking the undercurrent of challenge. Seb froze mid-step, his body tensing instinctively as the voice registered in his mind. He didn't need to look to know who it was, but he did anyway, his eyes snapping toward the figure emerging from the shadows. Alaric stepped into the clearing, his dark cloak flowing behind him like a ripple in the night, blending seamlessly with the shadows of the surrounding trees. His piercing blue eyes gleamed in the pale light of the moon, holding Seb's gaze with that unnerving intensity that always seemed to unsettle him. For a brief moment, Seb felt his breath hitch, his heart skipping a beat as the air between them thickened with unspoken tension. It wasn't the first time Alaric had this effect on him, but tonight, with everything that had happened, it felt heavier. "You're going to keep pacing like that, or are you going to speak your mind?" Alaric continued, his tone quieter now, almost measured. There was no immediate anger in his voice, no sharp edge like in their previous exchanges. Instead, it was laced with something that almost felt like curiosity, something Seb wasn't sure he wanted to entertain. He opened his mouth to retort but found the words stuck in his throat, his usual sharp responses fading in the face of the siren's unwavering gaze. Seb stood there for a moment, the silence between them stretching taut. It was as though the world around them had frozen, the air thick with the weight of the unspoken. He had been so sure of himself, so certain of the path he was on. And yet, in this moment, standing in the moonlit clearing with Alaric watching him with those penetrating eyes, he felt unsure, exposed in a way he had never allowed himself to feel. His fingers twitched at his sides, longing for something to grasp, but the only thing in reach was the air itself. Finally, Seb exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. "I don't know what you want from me, Alaric," he said, his voice quieter than he intended, betraying the frustration that had been building inside him for so long. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Every time we clash like this, it feels like we're falling apart. This isn't what I signed up for." The words hung in the air between them, raw and unfiltered. Seb felt his chest tighten, but he didn't look away. "I thought you'd gone back to camp," Seb said, his voice strained, betraying the exhaustion that weighed heavily on him. He didn't look at Alaric, unable to bring himself to meet the siren's intense gaze just yet. Instead, Seb stared out at the dark expanse of the forest, his thoughts spiraling in tangled knots. He had been pacing the clearing, trying to calm the storm inside his chest, but Alaric's presence had a way of unraveling whatever tenuous control he'd managed to maintain. "And missed the chance to settle this?" Alaric's voice was smooth, but there was an undercurrent of something sharp beneath the surface, something that made Seb's skin prickle. The words weren't an accusation, but there was a weight to them, a challenge Seb couldn't ignore. The siren stepped closer, his silhouette cutting through the dim moonlight, eyes never leaving Seb as though he were studying every inch of the man before him. "You've been avoiding me all night," Alaric continued, his tone lighter than it had been earlier, but still carrying an undeniable bite. Seb turned away, rubbing a hand over his face in frustration. He could feel Alaric's gaze burning into the back of his neck, the silence between them stretching longer than he liked. "Maybe because every time we talk, it ends in a fight," he muttered, his voice quieter now, laced with resignation. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Alaric or to himself, but the truth of it stung. The way their conversations always seemed to veer toward conflict, always on the edge of escalation, had become too familiar, too exhausting. It wasn't what he had wanted, but it was the only way things seemed to go. Alaric's chuckle, low and almost bitter, sliced through the tension, pulling Seb's attention back to him. "Maybe because you refuse to admit what's really bothering you," the siren said, his voice laced with an almost mocking amusement. There was no malice in his words, but there was something else, an edge, an understanding that made Seb bristle. As if Alaric could see right through him, could understand something Seb wasn't ready to face. Seb's jaw tightened at the remark, and he finally turned to meet Alaric's gaze, his own expression hardening. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to keep it calm. He was tired of these veiled insinuations, these subtle jabs that seemed to find their mark every time. He had always been able to control his emotions, to keep them buried beneath the surface. But Alaric, damn him, had a way of drawing out everything Seb tried so hard to hide. Alaric didn't flinch, his expression unreadable, but the flicker of something deep in his eyes made Seb hesitate. "You're not fooling anyone, Seb," Alaric said softly, almost too gently. "You think you can keep burying what you're feeling, but it's eating away at you. You can't just throw yourself into this mission and pretend it doesn't matter. You care about this more than you're willing to admit." Seb felt a pulse of anger flare within him, but it was quickly swallowed by something deeper, something that twisted in his chest. He didn't want to care, didn't want to be caught up in whatever it was that kept pulling him toward Alaric, but he couldn't deny it. The siren had a point. There were days, especially in moments like this, when Seb felt like everything he'd ever known was slipping through his fingers. And the more he fought it, the more he tried to bury the truth, the stronger the pull of that connection became. "Maybe I don't know what I'm feeling," Seb muttered, his voice thick with frustration, his shoulders stiff with the weight of everything he wasn't saying. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair again as if trying to ground himself, to shake off the overwhelming sense of vulnerability that Alaric's words had awakened. "But what I do know is that we're supposed to be a team. And right now, we're falling apart." Seb spun back to face Alaric, his temper flaring like a spark to dry tinder. "What's bothering me is your arrogance," he snapped, his words biting the cold night air. "Your need to be in control of everything, to have everything planned, measured, and predictable. I get it, you're the leader. You've always been the one holding the reins, but—" He took a sharp breath, his frustration rising with every word. "You don't leave room for anyone else, Alaric. Not for me. Not for anyone." The weight of his own feelings made his chest tight, but he couldn't stop himself. The words had been building for days, weeks, and now they spilled out in a flood. Alaric didn't flinch, but his silver eyes glinted with something dangerous, a flicker of something hidden behind the cool mask he wore. His lips curled into a slight smirk, but there was an unmistakable sharpness to his voice when he spoke. "And what about your need to push me away every time I get close?" he asked, his words cutting through the night like a blade. The accusation hung in the air, slicing into Seb with a precision that made his stomach tighten. It was a question Seb had been avoiding for so long, one he hadn't been ready to confront, let alone answer. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, a weight that pressed down on both of them. It wasn't the comfortable quiet they had shared in the past, the space where they understood each other without speaking. No, this silence was sharp, filled with tension, as though the very air between them had become charged. Seb could feel the weight of Alaric's gaze on him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet it. His jaw clenched, teeth grinding as he fought the emotions swirling inside him. Anger, frustration, and something deeper he dared not name. It was too raw, too vulnerable to let slip. His fingers dug into the palms of his hands, but it did little to quell the storm inside. Why had things become so complicated? Why couldn't they just work together without all the unnecessary conflict, the veiled emotions and unspoken truths. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead, he just stood there, frozen in place. The idea of letting those feelings surface terrified him. He wasn't supposed to be this person, caught up in feelings he couldn't control, tangled up with someone who made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. Finally, Seb exhaled sharply, his voice low and rough as it broke the stillness. "Why do you do this?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper, as if the question itself might be too much to bear. He could hear the vulnerability in his own tone, the crack of rawness that he hadn't meant to reveal. "Why do you make everything so complicated?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, an attempt to understand the one person who had become both his ally and his greatest source of frustration. Why couldn't Alaric just be simple? Why did everything have to come with such weight, such intensity? Alaric didn't answer immediately. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the night around them, the rustle of the trees, the distant call of an owl. Seb could feel his heart hammering in his chest, each beat a reminder of the frustration, the confusion, and the desire for clarity. He had never been good with emotions, and Alaric's constant ability to stir them up was maddening. He didn't know what he wanted anymore, only that the constant push and pull between them was wearing him thin. When Alaric finally spoke, his voice was softer than Seb had expected, the sharpness gone. "I don't mean to make it complicated," Alaric said quietly, his eyes searching Seb's face as though he were trying to read him, understand him. "But I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. I've spent my life being responsible for everything and everyone around me. I can't afford to let go of control, Seb. Not when the stakes are this high." His gaze never wavered, the vulnerability in his words surprising Seb, even as it left him feeling exposed. Seb's heart stuttered, a fleeting moment of understanding flickering between them. Alaric's walls were just as high as his own, but where Seb had always chosen to withdraw, Alaric had chosen to protect. He had been forced into leadership, into decisions that affected everyone around him. It wasn't an excuse, but for the first time, Seb saw the depth of the burden Alaric carried, something more than just arrogance or pride. Alaric had always been the one who had to hold everything together, even if it meant keeping everyone at arm's length. For a long moment, Seb just stood there, his mind racing as the weight of Alaric's words settled over him. Was he really so different from the siren he had resented for so long? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They were both trapped by the same thing, fear. Fear of losing control, fear of what they might feel if they allowed themselves to truly connect. And yet, here they were, standing on the precipice of something neither of them fully understood. Something that could either tear them apart, or bind them together in a way neither had imagined. Seb looked at Alaric, really looked at him for the first time in what felt like forever. The distance between them hadn't been just physical, it had been emotional, a chasm neither had been willing to cross. But now, as they stood there, the walls between them felt thinner, and Seb felt the pull of something undeniable, a bond that neither of them could ignore anymore. Alaric's footsteps were measured, each one bringing him closer, until the space between them seemed to disappear completely. Seb could feel the heat of his presence, radiating even through the chill of the night. Every movement Alaric made was deliberate, controlled, as though he was trying to force Seb to acknowledge something that had been unspoken for far too long. The weight of his approach left Seb unable to breathe properly, his chest tightening, caught between his instincts to pull away and the pull of something deeper, something he hadn't dared acknowledge until now. Alaric stopped just short of Seb, his eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made Seb's breath catch. And then those words came, soft yet piercing, a confession that sliced through the tension between them. "Because you're worth the complication." The sentence seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog, raw and unguarded. Seb could almost feel the impact of those words reverberating through him, stirring something inside him that he had buried, something he had tried so desperately to avoid acknowledging. His heart thudded painfully against his ribs, the weight of the admission settling over him like a storm gathering on the horizon. Seb swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as he stared at Alaric, trying to process what he had just heard. Alaric's usual bravado, the hard edge to his demeanor, had softened. His expression was no longer that of a leader standing firm, but of a person who had allowed himself to be vulnerable. In that moment, Seb saw something in him that he hadn't seen before, an openness, a tenderness that cracked the veneer of control Alaric had always maintained. It was achingly vulnerable, and it struck a chord deep within Seb. But despite the sudden rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm him, Seb took an involuntary step back, his mind scrambling for something, anything to hold on to. "This, we can't," Seb said, his voice tight with both desperation and fear. His words came out sharper than he intended, a protective instinct kicking in as he tried to put distance between them. "You know what's at stake." It was the same excuse he'd used before, the same justification for why he had pushed Alaric away at every turn. Their mission was too important, the risks too high. There was no room for distraction, no room for feelings that could cloud their judgment. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Alaric didn't flinch at Seb's words. Instead, he stood there, unwavering, his gaze never leaving Seb's face. "I know exactly what's at stake," Alaric replied, his voice steady, but the rawness beneath it was undeniable. There was no hiding the truth in his words, no deflecting the fact that, despite the danger, he was willing to face the consequences of their actions. "But I'm done pretending this doesn't matter." The intensity in Alaric's voice cut through Seb like a blade, each word digging deeper into the walls he had carefully built around himself. The simple, unadorned truth in Alaric's declaration forced Seb to confront something he had spent so long avoiding. Alaric had never been one to hide his feelings, but this was different. There was no bravado here, no carefully constructed walls. There was just Alaric, raw and open, his vulnerability laid bare for Seb to see. The walls Seb had built to protect himself began to crack, and with each passing second, it became harder to ignore the undeniable pull he felt toward him. Seb wanted to push him away, wanted to shut down before things went any further. But the words wouldn't come. His mind raced, struggling to reconcile the part of him that longed for connection with the part that screamed for caution. He had always been the one to keep things in check, to stay focused on the mission. But now, with Alaric standing in front of him, offering himself without hesitation, Seb couldn't ignore the way his heart skipped a beat. Alaric stepped closer still, his presence a steady weight against Seb's hesitance. He didn't say anything more, allowing Seb the space to come to his own decision. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken truths and emotions too raw to address. Seb's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he fought to keep himself grounded in the here and now. But the longer he stood there, the more the distance between them seemed to shrink, until it felt impossible to keep pretending that none of this mattered. In that moment, Seb realized something he had been too afraid to admit. Alaric was right, this did matter. More than the mission, more than the stakes they faced. There was a connection between them that couldn't be ignored, no matter how much Seb tried to rationalize it. He had spent so long keeping his distance, but the pull toward Alaric was undeniable. And for the first time, Seb allowed himself to feel it, to acknowledge the truth that had been lurking just beneath the surface. The tension between them, thick and palpable, remained, but it had shifted. Seb could feel it, the moment when things changed. And though the road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and difficult choices, Seb knew one thing for sure: they weren't going to walk it alone. Alaric's movements were swift, calculated, and before Seb could even process his thoughts, Alaric was upon him. In 2 long strides, the space between them evaporated, and Seb found himself caught in the grip of Alaric's hand, which clasped his arm with an intensity that left his skin tingling. The touch was electric, sending an immediate jolt through Seb, igniting something deep within him that he had tried so hard to suppress. For a moment, the world around him seemed to freeze, his breath caught in his throat as he looked up into Alaric's eyes, meeting the fierce, conflicted gaze that mirrored his own emotions. The weight of everything they hadn't said hung heavy between them. In the brief silence that followed, Seb could feel his heart pounding in his chest, an overwhelming mix of anticipation and confusion clouding his mind. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the world to shift so drastically in an instant. Alaric's presence was undeniable, his proximity burning like a fire Seb couldn't ignore. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, Alaric's face was suddenly closer, and with a quiet, deliberate movement, he leaned in, his lips brushing gently against Seb's in a hesitant, yet undeniably electric kiss. The sensation was like a spark, igniting a rush of emotions that sent Seb reeling. The forest around them seemed to vanish, the sounds of the night fading into a distant hum as everything narrowed to that singular moment, that touch, that kiss. Seb's mind went blank, his thoughts scattered in a whirlwind of sensation. It was everything he hadn't expected, but everything he had secretly longed for. He surrendered to the kiss, his hands instinctively reaching for Alaric's cloak, clutching it tightly as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. The softness of Alaric's lips, the warmth that seeped into him from that single touch, overwhelmed him. There was no room for thoughts or doubts now, only the raw intensity of the connection between them. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a release, a breaking down of the walls they had so carefully constructed around their hearts. The kiss was born of something deeper than mere attraction. It was tangled in the tension that had built between them over countless days of shared glances, brief touches, and the quiet understanding that had blossomed in the silence of their most dangerous moments. It was frustration, the kind that came from being so close yet so far apart, constantly at odds with each other, and yet drawn together by something neither of them fully understood. It was also unspoken longing, the yearning that had been brewing beneath the surface, quietly growing until it could no longer be denied. The kiss spoke of all the battles they had fought side by side, of the moments when they had shared unspoken truths through nothing more than a look. It was a culmination of everything they couldn't say, everything that had been left unsaid for far too long. When their lips finally parted, the world seemed to rush back into focus. The cool night air kissed Seb's flushed skin, and he gasped for breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His heart raced, each beat louder than the last as the realization of what had just happened hit him with full force. He stood there, dazed, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions flooding through him. Exhilaration surged within him, a high that felt as if he were standing on the edge of something new, something thrilling and terrifying all at once. But beneath the exhilaration, there was also fear, the fear of what this meant, of where this moment would lead them, and of the consequences that might come from it. Seb's eyes fluttered open, his gaze meeting Alaric's with a depth of questions he hadn't known he needed to ask. He saw the storm swirling in Alaric's eyes, confusion, longing, and something else, something deeper that spoke of vulnerability. Alaric's usual composure had been cracked wide open in that moment, revealing a side of him Seb had never allowed himself to truly see. His breath came in sharp bursts, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Seb wasn't sure what to say. Words failed him, too overwhelmed by the rawness of what had just passed between them. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of what they had shared and the uncertainty of what would come next. Seb opened his mouth to speak, to ask the questions that had been plaguing him, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he put into words what he was feeling? How could he ask Alaric what this meant without risking everything? But Alaric beat him to it, his voice a low murmur in the cool air, barely audible above the quiet rustling of the trees. "I didn't expect that," Alaric admitted, his voice a little rough, as if the words had taken more out of him than he had anticipated. His gaze was steady, yet there was something in his eyes, an openness, a rawness, that made Seb's heart ache. "But I'm not sorry." The weight of Alaric's words, coupled with the intensity of the kiss, left Seb breathless, as though the air had been knocked out of him. He had no answer to that, no way to explain how he felt in that moment. But somehow, he didn't need to. There was an understanding between them now, one that neither of them had been able to articulate before. "This changes everything," Seb murmured, his voice rough with emotion, the weight of the words settling heavily in the air between them. His breath still came in shallow bursts as his pulse thrummed in his ears, a stark contrast to the quiet of the forest surrounding them. The kiss had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Yet the taste of Alaric's lips, the warmth that had flooded through him in that brief moment, lingered like an unspoken promise. It was a promise that carried both the thrill of possibility and the threat of danger. Nothing could ever be the same now. Alaric's gaze softened as he held Seb's eyes, his grip on Seb's arm unwavering. "Maybe it's time for things to change," he said, his voice steady but layered with an emotion Seb couldn't quite place. It was as if Alaric, too, was grappling with the enormity of what had just transpired, trying to reconcile the weight of the moment with the dangerous path they were both on. The forest around them, the distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore, felt miles away in that instant. All that mattered was the shared understanding between them, the unspoken bond that had solidified in the wake of their kiss. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, charged with all the unacknowledged emotions that had simmered beneath the surface for so long. Seb could feel the pull between them, a force stronger than any logic or reason, and yet it terrified him. This wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not now. But as he stood there, under the muted light of the moon, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth, he realized he couldn't deny it any longer. Whatever had just shifted between them couldn't be undone, no matter how much either of them tried. The weight of their situation hung over them like a looming storm, its pressure growing with every passing second. They were on the brink of something monumental, something that could alter the course of everything they had worked for. The prophecy, the alliance, the dangers that awaited them, it all seemed to pale in comparison to what had just happened. The future was uncertain, and their mission was fraught with peril. Yet, for that brief, fleeting moment, it felt as though none of it mattered. The outside world could wait. They could face whatever came next together, for just a little while longer. Alaric's hand remained on Seb's arm, a steadying presence that grounded him in the midst of the storm swirling inside his chest. It was a small touch, yet it was laden with meaning, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. Seb closed his eyes briefly, taking a slow, deliberate breath, trying to push down the swirling tide of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. His thoughts were a jumble, uncertainty, desire, fear, all tangled together in a chaotic mess. But the one thing that cut through it all was the undeniable truth that had just been laid bare. Alaric was no longer just his ally. He was something far more complicated, far more essential. He opened his eyes to find Alaric still watching him, his expression unreadable but no less intense. There was a depth in Alaric's gaze that spoke of something more than just the physicality of their kiss. It was as though Alaric understood the gravity of the situation, the danger of what they had just allowed themselves to feel, yet was unwilling to look away. "We'll figure this out," Alaric said, his voice low, his thumb tracing a gentle line along Seb's arm, grounding them both in that moment. Together. The words settled between them like a quiet promise, a commitment that neither of them had made out loud until now. There were no illusions about what this meant, no denying the complexities, the risks. But in that moment, Seb couldn't help but believe him. He wanted to believe him. The future seemed uncertain, their path fraught with obstacles, yet the weight of Alaric's words, the sincerity behind them, offered a flicker of hope in the darkness. Seb swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening as he nodded slightly, unsure if he could fully find the words to express what he felt. "We'll figure it out," he echoed, his voice quieter this time, more uncertain. It wasn't an easy decision to make, and the consequences of their actions would ripple through everything they were working toward. But for the first time in a long while, Seb felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't realized he had been searching for: trust. The kind of trust that wasn't just about survival, but about something deeper, something that could carry them through the storm. And that, in itself, was enough to keep him grounded, for now. Chapter 23: The Siren's Betrayal. The council's chamber was a vast, imposing space, its high vaulted ceilings casting shadows that seemed to stretch for miles. The amber light from flickering torches created an eerie, almost suffocating atmosphere, its warm glow contrasting with the cold, stark marble that lined the walls. The air was thick with murmurs, the whispers of those gathered within the chamber crawling like insects across the stone floors. The room buzzed with accusations and conspiracies, veiled threats drifting through the crowd, each voice rising in pitch as the tension escalated. It was a place of power and betrayal, where every word held weight, and every glance carried the potential for ruin. Yet, amid the clamor, one name rang out louder than the rest: Alaric. But Alaric was not in the chamber. Not yet, anyway. He was still far from the heart of the storm that raged within those walls, standing in the darkened halls of the council's keep. The cold stone underfoot felt like a reminder of his isolation, his connection to the events unfolding slipping further away with each passing second. His wrists were bound tightly with iron shackles, the metal biting into his skin, sending painful reminders of his captivity. The physical restraint was nothing compared to the invisible chains of betrayal that weighed heavily on his chest. The sting of it was fresh, sharper than any wound, more crippling than the knowledge that he was now at the mercy of the very council he had once been a part of. It wasn't just the betrayal of power, it was the betrayal of trust. Standing across from him was the figure responsible for his downfall, Esrin. The same person he had once trusted with everything, his secrets, his plans, and even his heart. There had been a time when Alaric would have placed his life in Esrin's hands without hesitation, when they had shared the same ideals and fought for the same cause. But now, as he looked at Esrin, those memories felt like lies, their foundation crumbling beneath the weight of the betrayal. The sight of Esrin, standing there as if nothing had changed, caused something cold and sharp to twist inside of him. Why? Alaric's voice was low, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. The question was simple, but the anger behind it was anything but. It wasn't just a question of motives. It was the culmination of years of trust and loyalty that had been shattered in an instant. Why had Esrin done this? Why had they chosen to betray him in the worst possible way, when they both knew what was at stake? His voice trembled with quiet fury, but his eyes never left Esrin, searching for answers, for some shred of the person he had once known. Esrin's gaze met his, but it was no longer the familiar warmth that Alaric had once relied on. Instead, there was something hard and calculating in their eyes, a look that spoke of desperation and self-preservation. The expression that flickered across Esrin's face teetered between regret and defiance, as if they were trying to reconcile the actions they had taken with the person they once had been. There was a hesitation in their posture, a shift in the air between them as Esrin opened their mouth to speak. "You left me no choice, Alaric," Esrin replied, their voice steady, though it lacked the conviction that it once might have held. "The council would have found out eventually. I couldn't take that risk." There was a bitter edge to their words, a justification that didn't sit right with Alaric. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that stung. It was the fact that Esrin had done it under the guise of protection, as though their actions had been necessary, even noble. But Alaric wasn't fooled. He saw through the facade, and the sting of that realization was enough to make his blood run cold. Alaric shook his head slowly, the bitter taste of disbelief on his tongue. "You think I would have let them expose the prophecy? Let them tear everything we've built apart," he said, his voice growing stronger, more forceful with each word. The idea that Esrin had acted out of concern for him, or for the greater good, felt like a betrayal in itself. He had trusted Esrin with the plan, with the knowledge of what was to come, and yet Esrin had chosen to undermine it all for their own survival. Esrin's face remained impassive, but Alaric could see the conflict simmering beneath the surface. "I didn't have a choice. You had already gone too far. The council was already questioning your loyalty. If I hadn't stepped in, you would have been exposed, and everything we've worked for would have been lost." The words were defensive, and Alaric could hear the fear in them, no matter how much Esrin tried to hide it. It wasn't just a matter of saving their own skin. It was about preserving their place in a system that had always been brutal, always been unforgiving. For a moment, the tension between them grew suffocating, the silence hanging heavily as Alaric processed what had just been said. His mind raced through the implications of Esrin's actions, trying to piece together what had gone wrong, how they had come to this point. He had trusted Esrin with everything, his life, his ambitions, his future, and now, in the dim light of the council's keep, that trust had been broken. Alaric wasn't sure if he could ever rebuild it, even if they both survived what was to come. "I never thought you'd betray me like this," Alaric finally whispered, the words carrying more weight than anything he had said before. It wasn't just a statement of disappointment, it was the last piece of the foundation crumbling beneath him. His voice cracked with the realization that the person he had once believed in was gone, replaced by someone who had chosen to protect their own survival at the cost of everything else. The question now was what they would do with the remnants of that broken trust. Would they fight together, or had this betrayal severed their bond beyond repair? You couldn't take the risk? Alaric's voice was low, but it was edged with an intensity that vibrated through the air. He took a step forward, though the two guards flanking him moved to tighten their grip on his shoulders. The cold steel of their hands was a stark contrast to the fire that surged through Alaric's veins, but he didn't let it stop him. His gaze never left Esrin. You were part of this. You helped build this alliance. You knew what we were fighting for. You knew what was at stake. Esrin flinched at the words, but the defensiveness in their stance was immediate. They looked away briefly, as if gathering their thoughts, before they shot back, their voice cracking with the force of their emotions. And I believed in it. They seemed almost desperate to justify their actions, but there was a painful tremor in their words. But this wasn't just rebellion, Alaric. It was treason. When I realized how far you'd go, how far we'd all go, I had to act. Their words echoed in the space between them, a declaration that stung deeper than any physical blow. Treason. The word hung in the air like a poisoned arrow. It cut through the tension like nothing else could, severing the fragile thread of trust that had once connected them. The weight of it settled heavily on Alaric's chest, dragging his breath in short, sharp pulls. His heart raced, and for a moment, he couldn't reconcile the person standing before him with the Esrin he had once known. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. Treason, he whispered, as if the word itself had shattered him. The weight of it was more suffocating than the chains now holding him in place. He wanted to say something, to refute it, but the truth was, the damage had already been done. Esrin's hands were clenched into fists, their knuckles white with the effort. But there was something else in their eyes, a sheen of tears, a vulnerability that Alaric hadn't expected. It was as if, in that brief moment, the walls that Esrin had built up were faltering, and Alaric saw them for what they truly were, scared. Scared of the choices they had made. Scared of the consequences. You don't have to do this, Alaric said, his voice softer now, though his frustration was palpable. This isn't about the council. This is about you. About your fear. His words were slow, deliberate, as he tried to break through the layers of defense Esrin had built around themselves. You betrayed me because you couldn't bear the consequences of what we were doing. Don't you dare pretend this was about anything noble. Esrin's expression faltered for just a moment, the cracks in their facade beginning to show. For a brief instant, their resolve wavered, and Alaric saw something in their eyes, a flash of regret. But it was fleeting. In the next breath, Esrin straightened, the hardness returning to their features. The walls were back up. It doesn't matter what it was about, Esrin said, their voice regaining its steely edge. The council knows everything now. The alliances, the plans, even. Their words trailed off, as if the weight of the revelation was too much for them to fully voice. But Alaric knew what they were hinting at, and it made his blood run cold. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The betrayal had gone deeper than he'd feared. It wasn't just that Esrin had acted on their own accord. It was that they had shared everything with the council. Everything. The alliances they had forged, the strategies they had painstakingly planned out in secret, all of it was now in the hands of the council. There would be no room for diplomacy, no room for negotiation. The council had the power to tear apart everything Alaric had worked for, everything they had built together. Alaric swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat. You've doomed us, he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. His eyes burned with the intensity of his emotions, but he fought to hold back the flood of anger and sorrow that threatened to overwhelm him. His heart felt as though it had been wrenched from his chest, twisted, and left to bleed on the cold stone floor. Esrin had chosen to side with the very forces they had once fought against, and Alaric couldn't understand how they could have done it. How they could have thrown everything away so easily. Esrin stood there, unmoving, their face a mask of cold resolve, but Alaric could see the flicker of something in their eyes. A flash of uncertainty. A moment of doubt, perhaps, but it was gone before Alaric could grasp it. He took a step forward, closer to them, despite the guards holding him in place. "Did it ever matter to you, Esrin?" he asked, his voice raw with the weight of his emotions. "Did any of it ever matter? The cause? The fight? Or was it always about protecting yourself?" His voice broke at the end, the vulnerability he had been holding back spilling out. He wanted an answer, but a part of him knew it was already too late for that. Esrin's gaze shifted, and for a fleeting moment, Alaric thought he saw a flicker of regret in their eyes. But it was gone before it could settle. "You were too far gone, Alaric," they said quietly, almost as though speaking to themselves. "I couldn't follow you down that path." It was the final nail in the coffin, and the words reverberated through Alaric's mind like a death knell. There was no going back now. No chance for redemption. They had reached an impasse, and it was one that neither of them could escape. Esrin stopped short, the words dying on their lips, but the silence that followed said more than any explanation could. Alaric's breath hitched as the truth clicked into place, a sharp and sudden realization that pierced through the numbness settling over him. "Even Seb," he said, his voice low, almost disbelieving. The name hung in the air between them like a blade suspended mid-fall, sharp and waiting. The weight of it sank into Alaric's chest, heavy and unforgiving. Esrin's eyes darted away, shame twisting their expression. Guilt etched itself in the tense lines of their jaw, the downcast tilt of their head, and the way they refused to meet Alaric's gaze. That single, silent gesture shattered any remaining doubts. They didn't have to confirm it. The answer was already there, in their hesitation, in the way they shrank from his voice, in the flicker of remorse that couldn't quite mask their resolve. "You sold him out, too." Alaric's voice was just above a whisper, but each word landed like a curse, laced with betrayal and fury. The venom in his tone cut deeper than any accusation. The image of Seb, loyal, fierce, and unshakably by his side, flickered behind Alaric's eyes, and the pain of that imagined loss was almost too much to bear. If Seb had been dragged into this, if he was suffering now because of Esrin's betrayal, Alaric didn't know if he could ever forgive himself. Before he could say another word, the guards tightened their grip on his arms. Their silence was impersonal, their movements practiced. With a shove, they forced him forward, boots echoing against the cold stone floor as they approached the looming doors ahead. The carved wood split open with a heavy groan, revealing the council chamber beyond, a place of judgment, and now, a stage for his downfall. The room was packed with robed figures seated in rows along the curved table, their faces half lit by the flickering firelight from the torches on the walls. As Alaric was marched forward, the room buzzed to life, whispers sweeping through like a storm wind. He caught fragments of phrases: traitor, rebellion, alliance with the enemy, but none louder than the pounding of his own heart. They all stared at him as though he were already condemned. He was forced to his knees before the high table, the sharp stone biting into his legs. His iron shackles clinked dully as he settled into place, the final insult in a list of indignities. He kept his chin lifted, refusing to bow, refusing to break, not here, not in front of them. The firelight gleamed off the metal binding his wrists, casting twisted shadows across his face. In those flames, he could almost see the faces of everyone he had fought beside, faces now betrayed by the one who had claimed to protect them. At the center of the council table, High Chancellor Theron rose with deliberate slowness, his robes flowing like ink across parchment. His face was carved from stone, all sharp edges and cold judgment, and his eyes, clear and colorless, bore down on Alaric with a predator's focus. He said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it wrapped around the chamber like a noose. Finally, Theron spoke, his voice a blade honed by years of authority. "Alaric Venn," he began, each word pronounced with chilling precision. "You stand accused of conspiracy against the realm, forging alliances with enemies of the crown, and endangering the fragile peace we have worked so hard to maintain. The accusations echoed through the chamber like a sentence already delivered, and a hush fell as the words settled over them like ash after a fire. Alaric didn't flinch. He didn't drop his gaze. The truth was heavier than his chains, but he wore it with the pride of a man who had chosen his path and refused to regret it. Let them call him traitor. Let them speak of peace as if it hadn't come at a terrible cost. He had fought for something greater, for those forgotten by the council, for those trampled under their so-called order. If this was to be the end, then he would face it with unbroken defiance, because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would outlive them all. Alaric tilted his head upward, meeting the council's judgmental gaze with unwavering defiance. Though the shackles around his wrists remained cold and unforgiving, the fire in his eyes burned hotter still. "The peace you speak of is a lie," he said, his voice steady and sharp as a drawn blade. "It is peace bought with silence, upheld by oppression and fear. If standing against that makes me guilty in your eyes, then so be it. I'd rather fall for truth than kneel for a lie." A collective gasp swept through the chamber like a gust of wind, followed by a wave of murmurs and rustling robes. The gathered councilors shifted uneasily in their seats, some whispering to one another behind raised hands. But High Chancellor Theron remained unmoved, his expression carved from ice. He stepped forward with deliberate calm, folding his hands before him as though Alaric's words were little more than the buzzing of an insect. "Your bold words do you no favors," Theron said coolly. "Tell me, then, do you deny the evidence brought forth by your ally Esrin Cullis?" At the mention of the name, Alaric's gaze shifted to the edge of the chamber where Esrin stood under the heavy eyes of the court. Pale and rigid, Esrin looked every inch the reluctant witness. Their mouth was a grim line, and though they held their stance, something in their eyes betrayed them. Alaric saw it, a flicker of something buried beneath guilt and resolve. Regret, perhaps. But it was too late for regret to mean anything now. "I deny nothing," Alaric said, turning back to face the council, his voice resonating through the chamber like a vow. "Because the truth cannot be denied. Yes, I forged alliances. Yes, I took risks. But I did so in the name of justice, not treason. You may twist my actions to fit your narrative, but the cause remains just. You call it rebellion, I call it hope." A hush followed his declaration, broken only by the creak of Theron's chair as the Chancellor sat down again, his expression inscrutable. Then, slowly, a cold smile formed on his lips, one that carried neither humor nor mercy. "Justice?" he echoed, as if tasting the word on his tongue. "Is that what you call the reckless endangerment of countless lives? The destabilization of entire provinces? Your ideals may have once sounded noble, Alaric, but your methods have burned villages, sparked uprisings, and cost innocents their lives." Alaric clenched his jaw, feeling the tension ripple down his spine. He could still see those villages in his mind, some thriving in new freedom, others caught in the crossfire. Not all of their choices had been clean, but none had been made lightly. "War always brings suffering," he said quietly. "But it's not the resistance that struck first. It's this council's refusal to listen, to see. You speak of order, but you ignore the rot beneath it. My actions forced you to look." Theron leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Your actions forced the realm to the brink of collapse. There is no glory in that, only ruin." His voice grew sharper now, rising above the murmurs that followed. "And ruin is not a price we are willing to pay for your so-called truth. The laws are clear. Treason is punishable by death." The words hung heavy in the chamber, final and merciless. But Alaric didn't flinch. Instead, he held his head high, the defiance in his eyes unbroken. "Then let history remember me as a traitor," he said, his voice calm. "Because if standing for the voiceless means standing against you, then I will wear that title with pride." Theron didn't say another word. With a curt flick of his hand, he gestured to the guards. Without hesitation, they closed in, yanking Alaric roughly to his feet. His shackles clanked against the stone floor as they began to drag him toward the exit. The chamber's grand doors opened, and as he was pulled through them, the voices of the council swelled behind him, harsh, buzzing, and full of judgment. Their words blurred into a distant hum, echoing through the corridors like a swarm of bees stirred from their hive. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The torches lining the walls grew fewer, their light dim and flickering. Down they descended, past worn staircases and narrow tunnels, until they reached the lower levels of the keep. The river that ran beneath the stronghold made its presence known in the damp air, and the musty scent of mildew clung to every stone. When they reached the final cell, the guards shoved Alaric inside without ceremony. The iron bars groaned as they slammed shut behind him, the metallic clatter ringing in his ears long after they walked away. The cell was no more than a shadowed hole in the earth. Its walls were slick with condensation, the stone floor uneven and worn. A thin stream of water trickled somewhere in the distance, its sound eerily constant. There was no window, no light, only the oppressive weight of solitude pressing down like a second set of chains. Alaric leaned back against the wall, breathing slowly as his eyes adjusted to the dark. For a long while, he didn't move. He let the silence close in, let it surround him completely. His thoughts churned in an endless loop: Esrin's betrayal, Seb's name hanging in the air like a blade, the council's verdict echoing in his ears. The more he tried to make sense of it all, the more the storm within him raged. But amidst the chaos in his heart, one truth became painfully clear: Seb was in danger. And it was his fault. A wave of guilt crashed through him, nearly robbing him of breath. Seb had trusted him, believed in him. And now Seb's life, too, was caught in the council's web, dragged into the fire Alaric had lit. That thought stung worse than the betrayal, worse than the threat of death. It burned through his chest like ice, hollowing him out from within. But even in that hollow space, something else began to stir. It was anger, yes, but not the reckless, lashing kind. This was fire tempered by resolve, forged in grief and guilt and love. They had taken nearly everything from him: his freedom, his cause, his friends. But they hadn't taken the truth. They hadn't taken the memory of what he and Seb had shared. And they hadn't taken his will. Alaric straightened slowly, pushing away from the wall. His wrists throbbed where the shackles dug in, but he ignored the pain. Pain was a reminder that he was still alive, and where there was life, there was still a chance. They wanted him to break here. They wanted him to disappear into this forgotten hole in the ground, to vanish like all the others who had defied the crown. But he wasn't done. In that damp, lightless cell, Alaric made a vow. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a whisper in the dark, a breath of defiance in a place meant to crush it. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Not while Seb was still out there. Not while the truth still needed to be heard. He would find a way. One way or another, this wasn't over.